Hello. I'm very excited to be here. Welcome everyone to Hive Mind. I'm very excited to introduce Miriam Hillawi Abraham. Miriam is going to be doing some upcoming workshops with us here at Open Signal. They start this Friday. If you're interested in joining in, you can check out more on our front page at opensignalpdx.org. That's opensignalpdx.org. I'm very excited to talk with Miriam. I'm just going to introduce her and then we're just going to jump right in. Miriam is a multidisciplinary designer from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. With a background in architecture, she employs digital media as well as spatial and experiential design techniques to explore themes of equitable futurism, experimental conservation, and intersectionality. She holds an MFA in Interaction Design from California College of Arts and has received a BA in Architecture from the Glasgow School of Art. She's currently working on the game code instructor at Bay Area Video Coalition's youth program, where she infuses social justice, speculative imagination into her curriculum. Her work has been featured in the Fundamentalist magazine and exhibitions across San Francisco, including the Institute of the Future, California Academy of Sciences, and the Hubble Street Galleries. And she is a fellow of the Gray Area's Zachary Watson Education Fund and a Graham Foundation 2020 grantee. Like I said at the top, she has upcoming workshops here at Open Signal this Friday. Check out our page at opensignalpdx.org. Thank you so much for being here and doing this, Miriam.
Hi, thank you. I'm really excited to present this for you. Cool. Should I get into it?
Go for it. I'm really excited.
Sweet. Cool. Awesome. Cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own work and the topics of the themes of immersive storytelling and immersive technologies that I'm interested in. So to get started, as Jeff has introduced me, I'm a multidisciplinary designer from Ethiopia. And so my creative journey kind of began when I decided to become an architect. I was drawn to the field because I had this desire to change and reimagine the city I belonged in, and just being from a developing country, just imagining a better future and a better representation for that country and for the continent. And so I received my architecture degree from the Glasgow School of Art, and sort of based on my experiences in architectural academia and just looking for work in that industry as a migrant and as a woman of color, I just started to realize how sort of restrictive and exclusive that industry and that discipline is, and how much it is centered around like sort of Eurocentric thinking and often the male gaze as well. Surprisingly, the built environment is built around able bodies or the Corbusian like modular man. And so that was something I was grappling with. And when I sort of left and joined like my professional practice and worked a bit more, I decided to kind of explore a multidisciplinary or a hybrid practice. And so that's how I ended up at the California College of the Arts, trying to do grad school in multidisciplinary design program. And once I was there, I began my thesis, the Abyssinian Cyber Vernaculus, which is like a mouthful, but it's basically a body of work that involves activating the architectural sites of the Lalibela churches, which are these stone carved churches in the north of Ethiopia. And they have a lot of mystery around them. So I wanted to use visual narratives and emerging technologies like virtual reality, which are kind of like foreign within architecture and foreign within sort of African historical narratives, and just sort of like bridge that gap and find a way to infuse sort of speculative storytelling and equitable futurism or retrofuturism into that site. And so, that's kind of what ended up happening. And that through my exploration and through that sort of like self-learning and mixing and matching and like sort of appropriating tools that didn't necessarily feel like they belonged to me, I ended up in my current role as a game code instructor at the Bay Area Video Coalition San Francisco. And I also was awarded a grant from the Graham Foundation, which was founded in 1956 and kind of supported a lot of like amazing big name architects. So that was a really huge honor. So I'll be kind of continuing this project throughout this year. Cool. And so this is a little bit of my architectural work. So after leaving school, after my bachelor's, I worked in a number of little sort of gigs, part-time in a rural to urban planning initiative, and I also freelanced as a landscape architect. And so this is the work I did outside of my professional practice, and that's why it's a little bit more wacky. And I was really more interested in putting in narratives that kind of represented underrepresented identities and also placed women identifying people in the center of the built environment and built around them rather than kind of having them navigate through the outside or the underways or the edges of it. And while I was in grad school, I kind of got really interested in the idea of like game design and architecture kind of meshing together or intersecting, and how that could not only like activate these spaces and make them more meaningful through our layered experiences through the built environment, but also as a potential tool for participatory design and like experiencing the city in a sort of accessible way as well. So this was a little experimental project I did during my thesis year, and it's called The Diasporic City. And it was just like a little 2D side-scroller game that featured the Mission Bay in San Francisco and overlapped different like sort of architectural archetypes from different parts of Ethiopia. So the lonely wanderer who's like inspired by Sufi Muslim pilgrimage to Dere Sheikh Hussein Mosque in Ethiopia, and a really beautiful like composition by an like a really famous Ethiopian nun called Miriam. And so it's just like the diaspora, the nomad wandering through this sort of like modern city, but carrying memories of these architectures with her and kind of shifting that environment. So it was just like a quick experiment and just kind of drove me to want to investigate that further. And I'm planning, hopefully in the future, to just keep experimenting with those forms and those technologies. Other than that, I was really interested in thinking of scale and the human scale as like the site rather than just impacting the built environment. So I created this project. This was featured in Palo Alto in the Institute for the Future as part of the Afrofutures Festival, which was also hosted by BSAM, Black Speculative Imagination. And it's called Objects for the Othered, and it's a suite of tools designed to demand respect for women of color who have to kind of deal with microaggressions on a daily basis and also move through negative spaces. And so the idea is that each of these tools or adornments are inspired by Yoruba deities or orishas, particularly the sort of women identifying ones, and that whenever you're challenged or in these spaces where you feel challenged, the user can sort of summon them. So one is like a voice modulator. Those like little beads are hair beads that kind of fragment light when you feel like heavily surveilled in a space where you're not welcome. And then the other one is more of a speculative object that is like sort of like a little lightning rod thing that protects you when you're being antagonized by someone on the street. So like a street harassment tool. And the idea is that these tools will eventually become obsolete as like the sort of issues are sort of resolved around them. So thinking of tools that start off like sort of activated and functional and then become adornments over time. Just kind of like similar to culturally how our jewelries and how our artifacts may have represented something spiritual or functional, and then now have become adornments in a way and still remain relevant. Cool. So then back to Abyssinian cyber vernaculars. So the work is a series of visual narratives and virtual reality experiences designed to contest the active exclusion of Black and Brown formalisms from the architectural canon. It's also supposed to sort of counteract the apocryphal or like the sort of stereotypical stories about Africa. And there's a really great article on sort of the single story. That's Chimamanda Adichie's sort of line about the danger of a single story. But Binyavanga Wenena talks about how to write about Africa. And it's a really great article, like a satirical article about that, about how sort of poverty porn and like how the exotic other and stuff comes to play in sort of justifying the dominion of Western institutions over artifacts and over our futures, essentially. So the project kind of attempts to uncover and reinstate the presence and power of individuals or identities sort of demonized by the dominant, very conservative, very religious ethos of Ethiopian society or general like Horn of African society. And so the idea is that these spirits, be they women, be they like queer identities or queens and warriors, are kind of conjured during the virtual reality experience. And so more about the site of the medieval rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, originally called Roha, is in the northern highlands of Ethiopia. I had like the great privilege of visiting it when I was like a couple of years ago. And there are these incredible, it's like this incredible complex that's made up of the 11 churches that are carved from what is called living rock. So just like the whole bedrock of basalt is carved downwards and sideways to create these monolithic churches. And it's like one of the highest concentration of these monoliths in the world. And unlike most monolithic churches, which take hundreds of years to build, the idea or the claim is that these were built in less than 24 years, even though there's this sort of like conflicting narratives around them. And that's something that I always like kind of struggled with my architectural heritage here. It's like, what is the truth, or what's the bottom? Like, how do we get to the bottom of the truths behind these things, of who dwelled in them, and what their intentional use is for, before sort of this monotheistic or singular narratives of Christianity and like hegemonies around belief and society just surrounded them and kind of engulfed the stories around them. And so that's something that makes it hard for you to assert your belonging in your culture and your narrative and your history, is just trying to break that hegemony and trying to find like multiplicity within those stories. So that was what I was interested in. And so much of the knowledge and their origins is really warped and also sort of contained and interpreted by sort of what I identify as the three experts, or the three types of experts of these types of sites. And it's obviously the religious expert, the white savior or the white institute, and then the Hotep. And when I say Hotep, it's basically a person who is often a man from the African diaspora who is super into conspiracy theories, but also really like woke and might not be as progressive as they think they are. So there is still a lot of argument around the construction and their intended use or the initial use of these buildings. Yeah, and the churches gained their fame in Europe after the visit of Francisco Alvarez, a chaplain and a member of the Portuguese embassy who was sent in a convoy in 1515, so years after the churches were allegedly built. And he was lured to the country by the lore of Prester John, who is allegedly like a king who led a Christian nation amidst Muslim territories. So the territories surrounding Ethiopia were mostly occupied by Muslim leaders. And here's a quote from one of his accounts, which kind of goes to show you of like the idea of like Africans or members of the global South not being able to possibly create something ingenious in that time or in that time frame. He says, "I weary of writing more about these buildings because it seems to me that I shall not be believed if I write more. Because regarding what I had written, they may blame me for untruth, and therefore I swear by God, in whose power I am, that all that I have written is the truth, and there is much more than what I have written, and I have left it, that they may not tax me with its being falsehood. And there's more in his accounts that talks about like how could it possibly be Ethiopians who had built this, and potentially some Arab or European settlers. And again, this is something that is also present in academia, surrounding not only these churches but other sites and artifacts. And so through this project, I wanted to create, to use immersive storytelling or experiential storytelling methods, and attempt to activate the existing architecture through 3 parallel narratives constructed around the self-proclaimed experts of the site that I'd mentioned. And I called them sort of engineers of hegemonies. And again, it's the Western academic, as portrayed by my character, Kentucky Johnson, loosely based on Indiana Jones, the conservative Orthodox Christian Ethiopian man. I've named him Johannes for now. And then the Hotep, pro-Black yet non-progressive cis male, and his name is Sebi the Enlightened. So each of these characters are going on a hero's journey, and the idea is like to subvert or to play with the trope of the hero's journey, where each of them is seeking conquest, enlightenment, or like glory of some sort. And each one is sort of going through an unexpected journey of unlearning or finding out they might be the bad guy. Cool. And this is like a quote that I really like from Sun Ra, where he talks about appearing as real, or appearing as a myth before someone. And if someone does not recognize you as a human, or if you're dehumanized, are you then a myth? And he just kind of plays with this idea of reality, or the tension between realities and representation. And it's something I was interested in when I was creating this project and the narratives around this project. This idea of existing myths and creating myths, my own myths that are just as believable or just as valid and just as like false, to contest the existing myths or to add multiple perspectives. So the original myth of Lalibela is that the king Lalibela, as told by his hagiographer, or his the person who wrote his account, was surrounded by a swarm of bees when he was a young child, the day of his birth, and that was like sort of golden buzzing halo, and that indicated a prophecy that he was destined to be king. And there's this whole story how his older brother, who was king at the time, was jealous, tried to poison him, and he escaped, and this whole thing. But he was then visited by angels, and when he fled, at some point he fled to Israel, or the story goes that he may have been whisked up by the angel Gabriel, and like taken to Israel, where he could see the holy city of Bethlehem, or Jerusalem, sorry. And then he sort of earned his Christian name, or his holy name, because now he's a saint of Gebre Meskel Lalibela. And when he was sent back, he decided that he would use the holy plans to create a similar, like a Jerusalem for his own people, rather than them having to kind of cross these treacherous paths across the Red Sea and through sort of adverse surrounding territories to go make their religious pilgrimage. So the idea is that people now make a pilgrimage here, and the Lalibela churches are still an active site, and it's an active UNESCO site as well. So that means you can still visit there, but they still hold church services within them. They still have monks living inside who perform like sacred rites and rituals. And so it's still like very much active and has maintained that history. But there's still a sort of mystery around it, where the churches may or may not predate Christianity in the region, or the king's reign even. And there's so much evidence around like how there's a lot of fortification, like there's ravines, and the churches are sort of submerged, and you can't even see them until you are close enough to see the hole that they're in. And so there's clearly this sort of fortification and stuff around it. And there's theories that it could have been a kingdom. One of the churches may have been used as a holding cell or a jail, because it was like on a cliff edge. And there's all these locking mechanisms and stuff that have been found within the wooden doors. Other than that, there's also these interesting like remnants from different cultures, like from um, medieval India. There's like shields from Nubia and things like that that are still, again, when you go visit the site. In my experience, the tour guide is like, oh, the angels brought them over, or the angels. So yeah, there's this like sort of this narrative that blocks you from learning more or from imagining more. So in my version of the myth, I went ahead and came up with this completely made up myth that was interesting because the way the myth operates as a way of contesting the other one is that the moment I kind of start saying it aloud or infusing it with as much believable history as possible, people start to believe it themselves, unless you're talking about to someone who already knows about it. And so um, in my myth, it claims that the last ruler of the Aksumites, so the Aksumite kingdom, was there just before Lalibela, and that last ruler had enlisted the guild of Tahanasi, which is a completely made up guild, and they are an imaginary guild made up of skilled members from different empires that existed around the same time as Aksum. The guild was responsible for the construction of the iconic monoliths, for different iconic monoliths all over the world, and they achieved these impossible achievements through the use of mechanized carving machines and diggers. The machines can burrow into stone, lift rubble, drill into bedrock, and transport debris. And the idea is that they're responsible for all these different monolithic structures you can see in Turkey, in Ethiopia, Sudan, and elsewhere. And there's no reason why they weren't. So it started off, this project sort of started off by building these myths into these comic books that I created. And then the comic book was also a really great method to test immersive reality, immersive storytelling, because it is almost experiential in the way that you are seeing a visual narrative play out, but it is still a passive experience. And the idea was that it was sort of my storyboard for the world building that I was kind of about to take on in virtual reality. And so that myth turned into these sort of machines that I quickly built in Blender and turned them into these sort of gold burrowing machines. And world building became kind of like a huge undertaking for me. It wasn't just reproducing the sites and sort of reimagining them and retexturing them and adding characters, but it was also about navigation. How do people move through the virtual terrain? I started doing landscaping in the virtual world, like creating these things called hahas, which are like these Welsh sort of ditches that stop sheep from falling over a path or from losing their way on a path. And so that kind of got the player to walk along the path that I wanted them to walk along. And just loads of like different elements, like in one of the virtual experiences, the one that's about the religious expert, Johannes, your character or you as a player travel back into the past, and there was this element of like, how do you portray the past? Is there like a fog because there's like a foggy filter over our memories? And is there also these sort of like antiquated looking people that I have to create that represent the guild and that look distinctly different from the existing characters? Because the experience starts off as you entering a tour with a bunch of other tourists and you wandering away from that tour and walking into the past. So yeah. And then in the other experience, this was called Sebi the Enlightened. In this experience, the Hotep walks, you as a Hotep embodied in virtual reality, you'd walk along the path following some signs or symbols, and you're kind of expecting this sort of enlightenment or this confirmation of your beliefs of like sort of Black power or sovereignty. And you accidentally conjure or awaken a goddess who's been laying dormant underneath the site. And she kind of embodies, I sort of like created like her to be like someone who embodies all these goddesses who are demonized or who were kind of edged away as seen as sort of pagan or not, or yeah, demonic. and as well as queens whose narratives have been also erased or forgotten about, like Yodit or Gudit, who allegedly took down the whole of the Aksumite Empire with a huge fire. Sidama Queen, who used to allegedly hang her enemies by their testicles, and Arauelo as well, who is a Somali queen, and loads of sort of queens or warriors and things that we weren't taught about in history here, but we know were sort of present or we hear echoes of them. In the experience, the goddess also conjures in her hand, she conjures what are called the Zar. And Zar in North African culture are sort of like jinn, sort of like ghosts or demons or like kind of otherworldly things that are supposed to be bad. And they're often seen in our culture when a woman is like being too outspoken or someone is being queer. It's often mistaken for you being possessed by Zar. And initially in my research, I found that Zar were a community of people that were often gender nonconforming and led by women or led by different identities. And so through the Christian narrative and the Muslim narrative, they were kind of warped and warped and warped into being these demons and these ghosts. And so in this virtual reality narrative, the goddess conjures them into her palm, and they're seen as sort of more human. And so within the world building, there was a lot of work outside of the environment to create characters. And as I'm not an animator, it was all about like how do I adapt like models, and how do I create them to be distinctly suited to each story. And each of the characters were actually voiced by my friends and family members, reading off of scripts that I'd written. And it was really interesting to see how the virtual presence of these people that I know in real life were kind of embodied by these characters as you walk up to them, and they're kind of animated when they see you. And so the idea of the story is also built off of here, like eavesdropping. So as the player, as you're walking around, you hear these NPCs talking behind your back, having private conversations, commenting on things. And so that kind of creates this world around you that feels more legitimate or makes the simulated environment believable. And this is a little snapshot from the comic for Kentucky Johnson, where the narrative is that he and his partner, whoever, are coming in to steal the Afro Aigba cross, which is like a 7-kilogram gold cross that is always carried out during processions in Lalibela. And his narrative, which we always hear in Indiana Jones, is that it belongs in a museum, which brings us to like the repatriation of artifacts that have been looted in the past. And what do we mean by it belongs in a museum, and where can that museum exist? And so in the experiences based on his narrative, the idea is that, again, you're a hero, and it's kind of loosely based on, how do I forget the name? But one of the Indiana Jones like early video games, where the idea is you're going to go take the Ark of the Covenant, and you just go and get it and you win. And so this idea of like conquest and like getting these artifacts from these bad guys is sort of another like myth along like looting as like a heroic act, and like sort of preserving it in this unreachable museum for money, essentially. And so within the experience, you're seeing little artifacts that are scattered around that he's collecting as collectibles, and kind of playing off of the gameplay, or the really traditional gameplay of like going and picking things up and earning points as you pick them up, and you're going bigger and bigger trying to get the big treasure and avoiding adversaries. And he also has a little helper who's based on Short Stack, or is that his name? Short Stack, I think, or Short Straw from the movies. And again, that is like a little like colonial as well, to have a little scout that you're deceiving to go and get you into these sacred spaces. So within the game, you're collecting these artifacts, and they're also based off of like real, like sort of religious paraphernalia and relics, including the cross. During the exhibition, I wanted to fabricate these so that there was like some tangible objects in real life that bridged the immersive experience with our physical reality. And by building like familiarity, you're, for one thing, like making the new myth like real by supporting it with actual physical evidence, by saying these were excavated from the virtual site. And that's kind of how you build off of a myth. You have certain pieces of evidence or relics and things. And then also just kind of elevating it to sort of museum status by putting it in vitrines and just creating that bridge between the two experiences of approaching something physically and then being immersed in it. Yeah, and so this was just kind of the way it was set up during my exhibition, the Hubble Street Galleries, and then also during my thesis. And I chose virtual reality because of its ability to suspend the audience in time and space, and also gave me the ability to infuse new meanings into sites that may be real or unreal. The reason I kind of chose VR and when I did it was before it became, or the industry or the practice became too disciplinary and restricted to people who are VR experts. And I think that's when you kind of come in and claim that as a tool that can be used for Black and Brown imagination, or a tool specifically for self-determination and creating these sort of imaginary futures and pasts that we can dwell in and be empowered in. Yeah, and sort of digital tools are kind of expanding as well in the context of like things like preservation and scanning of artifacts and sites. And so that, again, is starting to become disciplinary in itself. And how do we choose what is important to preserve? And that's always been a conversation within architectural conservation and within archaeology, as like cities are expanding and the things that we held dear to us are changing. But how do we use digital media to sort of protect these artifacts and protect these cultures and identities? So here's a short clip. I don't know if it's gonna play, but here's a short clip of the experience. I can play it if we have time.
Would you get a load of this? The medieval churches of Lalibela, 8th wonder of the world. 11 churches carved from a single rock. It's still uncertain who's responsible for this design. Okay, Kentucky, stay focused. You're here to recover Afro Aegba, the 7-kilogram gold cross of King Lalibela. I'm trying to get to Bet Madame Alain. Think you can show me where that is, sport?
Sure thing, mister. I can carry your bags, yes?
Thanks, kid. Oh, boy. This would be worth a pretty penny on the black market.
I think that belongs to the church.
Right, of course. I'll just hold on to it for safety. We're finally here. Hey, little guy, do me a favor. Stay out of here and be my lookout, will ya? Cross must be just beyond that pillar.
No!
I need to get that cross.
It's safe where it is and always has been. With its people. All you foreigners want to do is take. Turn back now while you can.
This doesn't concern you. Well, it's now or never, Kentucky.
Say, what a blessed day. I've been dreaming of coming here my whole life.
Haven't you ever thought that there was more to the story of this place? Come with me if you seek answers.
But the tour?
Never mind the tour. Follow me and you'll learn exactly how this place was made. You'll learn who built it and for what purpose.
Merhaba Miriam. kind of sorcery is this?
The Axumites were forced to retreat to the mountainous town of Roha. They called on the guild of Tanesi.
Salam, stranger. Grab a tool and join us. We need all the help we can get.
The guild was a group of trained architects and artisans from different empires.
Selassie, I am here at last, Zion. Now may awaken the king within me and shed the woes of the white man cruelty. Jah! I feel drawn to this place. There's some kind of primal pull beckoning. Babylon, what is this? Who are you?
You may call me by many names as I have many selves. You see, they are naming me every time I was named so that I would not be known to anyone, even unto myself. They undressed me every time I was dressed so that I would not be recognized as anyone but myself. For how hard they tried, for how much they despised me, they could not destroy me. I am Wak, the energy in all things, the entropy after death. I am the blackness in your skin, the sunlight you absorb. I am your beating heart and your blistering rage.
Sorry you had to hear my cousin's terrible accents. The music was created by my cousin Mikhail Seifu, who's an Ethiopian electronic artist. Really, really great music. You should check it out too. But yeah, thank you for checking that. Thank you for watching that. It was a little choppy because it was filmed from the experience of virtual reality, and you're walking and teleporting or moving through that like some sort of janky locomotion. Yeah, so that's kind of the project, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the themes around the immersive storytelling that I'm interested in, and the artists that kind of inspired me, or the artists that I look to kind of figure out what my lens is. And there's a few quotes peppered everywhere, but I won't read all of them. So when defining immersive storytelling, we talk about immersive storytelling a lot, but it is something that's vague and we often tie it to technology, but in its general sense, it is something that creates a sense of presence, encourages the audience to be active and participate within the narrative, and rather than just being passive observers. And ultimately, the goal is to leave a lasting and memorable emotional effect or experience. Dorothy Santos, who's a design critic in the Bay Area, sort of loosely defined it as imagining sort of like 3D films, and essentially being visually engulfed and absorbed by the surroundings that you're seeing in the movie screen. When we talk about immersive storytelling before sort of head-mounted displays and VR, AR, it takes me back to thinking about Goosebumps and sort of these like choose your adventure novels where you're an active participant of the story, and you're still going down a script. There is still a predetermined path, but you don't know. You're still being an active character within the narrative, and not just a sort of like ghostly viewer. And then you also have the really old school like Viewmaster, which is uses stereoscopy to create a very passive but almost immersive experience. It's almost a VR postcard of a place. And so now that we have VR and the capabilities are insane, like not only are you visually immersed in something and sonically immersed, but you are also embodying and enacting something. And there's also haptic feedback, and there are elements of like interactivity and tactility within the worlds that you're experiencing. And so just within the potentials of experiential storytelling, there is like the power we can gain power through the approximation of realities, through imagining futures and pasts. We are also kind of empowering ourselves and building a path to them. And so that is when the immersive storytelling can be a great tool for activism and also for just like self-determination. Creating participation and placemaking also in VR. There's also this theory coined by like Chris Milk from Within, which is like a big corporation, empathy machine. So VR is an empathy machine, which I take issue with because I don't think you can manufacture empathy. And then the possibilities of education through exposure, and then thinking about like accessibility, how we can access sites and places if we're not physically able to, or if we're displaced because of a range of different issues. So VR becomes an instrument that can be used for social justice, education, radical reimagination. And this potential has been demonstrated by different contemporary artists of color who are from the continent and the diaspora and all over the world, who I have drawn like inspiration from during my process. Nora Khan also talks about this like God's eye when you're a world builder, and how you're not ever sort of neutral. And so like technologies and companies that are giving you the power to assert yourself, creating your own simulations and your own realities, they can still be basic. They may seem banal, but they can also be sort of violent in themselves if you're not careful. So there's limitations around immersive technologies, and just to name a few, there's like barriers within our communities, with different economic backgrounds or underrepresented communities, and that is often due to the digital divide and also affordability of the tools, which are becoming more affordable. But again, creating work within it is also difficult, because is it something that can be monetized and that will be sold, and there's all that. There's accessibility, because there's still issues of you're still physically exerting yourself, and some are not able to access these tools and still feel the same sense of limitations as physical reality. This kind of worrying issue that VR tools and augmented reality may be used as instruments for surveillance capitalism, and there's this underlying kind of fear that I have as well of, like, for example, the new Oculus has cameras all around the outside and the inside to track your room as a way to just kind of track your movements. But then that could easily be streamed real time, and it is being streamed. So what does that mean for us in the future? And then there's also what I'm more interested in is in subjectivity versus objectification, and just thinking of VR as a tool for representation, the way that cameras initially were, and cameras in the hands of like colonizers and stuff were used to promote that narrative, and also place the other as a static figure, as someone who doesn't have agency, as someone who's exotic and other. And how is that happening with VR now? And is there a sense of digital colonialism? There's also like corporations now taking part in XR, AR, VR, and are they kind of trying to exonerate themselves from their own kind of negative contributions to society by creating things like what Google did on the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, which is like an AR rainbow that just explodes off of Christopher Street in New York. And so there's kind of all these issues that are surrounding this technology already. To talk about the empathy machine a bit more, kind of back to Chris Milk and Within and his collaboration with the UN. So they went to like war zones, created this project called Clouds Over Syria, which is a 360-degree video set in a camp for Syrian refugees. And again, it was kind of this sort of, here, now that you see people who don't really have the privilege of privacy and privilege of a safe home, do you just suddenly have empathy? And he kind of preaches that like VR gives you empathy because you are embodying that. But there is this issue of if you're not sort of experiencing it long enough to experience lived experiences of someone else and understand their histories? Are you actually gaining empathy, or are you just there as a sort of tourism of someone else's life or someone else's issues and troubles? But what distinguishes VR from previous media apparatuses is that it kind of affords you some freedom to explore, and you have more like sort of interactions and stuff, and you have an ability to learn for yourself and to be suspended, or to suspend disbelief and believe in that virtual world for a minute. So it depends on kind of who is behind the stories that's creating them. And this is my favorite quote from Toni Morrison, who talks about bringing the center and the edge. So she says she stood at the border and claimed it as central and let the rest of the world move over to where she was. And that kind of brings me to all these artists of color from different parts of the world who are using immersive media to bring these narratives that were often seen as edge or other, and making them sort of as legitimate and as important by just getting us to experience it and kind of revel in the specificity of the experience or the story, rather than translating it and bridging that gap of ignorance. Hive Labs is my favorite kind of group that explored VR through their neurospeculative Afrofeminist project, which is basically a VR experience where you're sitting in their future cosmetology lab, and you are embodying a Black woman that you'll see in the mirror sitting in the salon, and they braid in what they call like an Octavia hair extension or cranial extension. And then it's like an Afrofuturist hair extension that plugs into the back of your brain, and you're suddenly immersed in this futuristic or otherworldly environment, and you're moving through it slowly and moving towards these sort of godly beings that are like sort of figures of the oppressed, but kind of they have agency and power now. Olalekan Jeyufus is a Nigerian, New York-based architect who uses architecture to reimagine a post-colonial Africa, particularly Lagos, through his project Mad Horse City, which is an incredible 360 experience where you're seeing this like what he calls like slum architecture being as like the future infrastructure, or a futuristic and a really sophisticated infrastructure of a future Africa. There's Lawrence Leck, who coined the term Sinofuturism, which he describes as a sort of invisible movement, kind of based off of Afrofuturism, but more of something that's more satirical. And he talks about how Sinofuturism is a critical and playful approach to subverting the cultural cliches of China, which is orientalized by the West, but also like heroic in the country itself. And he's embracing 7 key stereotypes of Chinese society, which is computing, copying, gaming, studying, addiction, labor, and gambling, and just heightening that experience into creating this weird futuristic environment. Again, bringing us to his world rather than us translating that world, making it more palatable. Again, there's loads of artists within the sphere that I really like Jacoby Satterwhite, who explores like choreography, voguing, queerness, mental health through his really intense virtual arenas. And then back to the topic of digital conservation and colonialism, which initially digital colonialism was defined as like the sort of scramble for Africa through our user data. We're accessing our user data, but in countries in the global south where we're like sort of negotiating for the return of stolen artifacts, digital conservation or digital like fabrication can be a sort of interesting or important tool to regaining access to these things that are still not available to us. And again, these things are also, at least the digital scanning, the digital conservation of these objects are still trapped within institutions that we can't necessarily access as the stewards of the sites. And so one example is obviously the Elgin marbles in the British Museum that are still not returned to Greece. And they claim, oh, there's like faulty earthquake lines or whatever. And but there's still people who kind of take in to like Sketchfab and other platforms to scan and make these objects available. But what parts of that are lost in translation when you're scanning something you don't have in your hand, or when you're modeling something you don't have? And so Iranian artist Morashin Alayari kind of defines or redefines digital colonialism as a framework for critically examining the tendency for information technologies to be deployed in ways that reproduce colonial power and relations, especially in terms of 3D printing and 3D scanning, and just kind of how you could possibly use or misuse a construction of the lost artifacts or the endangered artifacts and cultural sites. And her cultural sites are specifically the Middle East. And these are just like sort of things to contextualize that, how technology is taken away from like the people who it exploits. So in her project, She Who Sees the Unknown, which is a long-term research project, she recreates these sort of monstrous female figures from the Middle East, kind of who I drew inspiration from when I was building my goddess. And my goddess was kind of based on Bilqis, who is the Queen of Sheba or Saba, who again shares a history in the Middle East as well. And so she does a really interesting job of sort of creating these virtual experiences, but also reproducing them as 3D printed files that have flash drives embedded in them that everyone can access and sort of reproduce. And yeah, there's loads of different artists. I don't want to take up too much time, but there's different artists who are just taking part in that same kind of style, like Ibeyi Camp, who uses 3D scanning to recreate different sites in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, and parts of London. And yeah, there's just different methods of storytelling. I don't know if I should keep going or if Jeff wants to jump in.
I can jump back in.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated. I'm like writing down all these names because I haven't heard of so many of them. So I was very intrigued by all these. Thank you so much, Miriam. That was, I feel like I learned so much, not just about, in general, kind of like immersive storytelling and your work. And it's so intriguing, especially at the end, to tie it in with all these other artists of different diasporas around the world, and to see that there's so much of it going on when I don't think that's, highlighted in, you see in an Oculus commercial or anything. So I thought that was fascinating. Yeah, I did have a few questions. I know you work at the Bay Area Video Collective and the youth program. So I was wondering kind of what can you pass on to the next generation with this work? Like what are you looking to pass on?
Cool. I think we usually talk about how we're preparing our students for jobs or industries that may not exist yet. And so we often talk about how we're allowing them to imagine roles or imagine spaces that they become the creators of, or the people who sort of manage and protect those things. And so I think what I always try to pass off is like speculation as like a really powerful tool, and kind of using personal narrative and allegory and abstraction to creating things that are like playable, but also meaningful.
Nice. And yeah, I guess from that, that everybody's speculating what it's going to become. Do you have an idea of what your role going forward is, or what you're kind of looking forward to in the industry, or without the industry, outside of the industry?
I still don't know. That's still a thing of like which industries do you belong in if you're pursuing like a hybrid thing, and what role do you serve? So that's something I'm still trying to figure out.
Do you think about just architecture, physical architecture? Do you think about transposing any of the things that you've created in these virtual worlds into physical space?
Yeah, definitely. That's something I've been really interested in. And I think what led me to the virtual is like not being able to practice like my subjectivity or be able to actually take on like a really big role in architecture. And so it became a place for like playing and figuring things out. But essentially, I do want to build things or design things in the real world. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things we talk about here at Open Signal is most of us are filmmakers. And so we're dipping our toe into VR and XR and seeing this emerging industry, you know, all these different things that are coming out and seeing, you know, where our place is within it. And I think that's really fascinating to see. Because something like architecture is definitely a white dominated, male dominated field. So yeah, it's interesting. The kind of the combination of all of these things, especially what you're talking about of subjectivity versus the objectification, like the creation of these things. Yeah, I think that's just a fascinating thing, and I don't know if you can touch on that a little bit more, but I think it's one of the things that I worry about seeing things created now. Is there anything more you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think just dipping my toe in like the sort of emerging VR industry. Like I was in an incubator with Oculus for a bit and just kind of seeing what things were pushed forward or valued or within the communities that like are like I'm a VR creator. It was all a lot about like I'm gonna go to a village in Africa and do a 360 video, and that's my work or my legacy, which is like again, who like what is the point of like the person being captured in VR if they may never see it or they're trapped in this representation that they haven't chosen to be represented as? And again, that just kind of purposes that sort of like single story narrative.
Yeah, I was wondering that about your work, about what your connection to these churches was before you created them in a virtual world. You had seen them physically recently, but do you have any kind of connection to them before?
I think we just have like a huge national pride around these artifacts, just like um, as like the country like really values like tourism as like a sort of economic or cultural exchange program. And there is so much like national pride in these sites. The fact that Ethiopia is called the cradle of humanity, where like loads of like early human debris and things like that were found. That's like one sort of point of national pride. But we're also religious, so like evolution. And then there's like early kingdoms, pre-Christian, that we don't really talk about, but the Christian ones are really proud of. And so that was the kind of contention. I felt like I grew up always seeing like models of them, images of them, people going to them often and like being like, oh, I want to go see it someday. And being so like it was so stunned by what I saw and what I experienced, but also so frustrated by not being able to impose my own fantasies on it, but also like get to the bottom of the truth behind it.
Interesting. Do you think there's a difference between, say, Ethiopians and their connection to that, as opposed to you spent time in the UK, like their connection to, say, like Stonehenge? Do you think there's a different, like a correlation to that?
I think there is a correlation, as in like this is endemically ours and doesn't exist anywhere else. You should come see it. But there is more of like a passion here and like places like Egypt and other parts of the world like India, where through colonialism and through academia, we're always kind of like really find it hard to believe that these cultures and their past like were able to kind of even come up with these structures or these objects and these techniques and maths and all these things. And so these artifacts and heritage sites become this like national way of proving that we could do it or we did it. So there is that little bit of like tension between the people who are coming to see it, like the tourists, the West, and the place you're in.
Awesome. Well, we just got to 1 o'clock. Is there anything else you want to say before we finish up?
I'm just glad that you guys had me. I'm really honored to be featured in this event.
Yeah,
So thank you.
yeah, we're really excited that you did this. And if you didn't hear at the top, Miriam is teaching workshops starting this Friday at OpenSignal. You can go to opensignalpdx.org to find more. There is a post on our blog, or you can look at our calendar at opensignalpdx.org. Thank you so much, Miriam. I learned a ton. I'm really excited to see what these workshops are about. And if you want to watch your work, you can go see the Abyssinian Cyber Vernaculus at watch.opensignalpdx.org. It is a featured video there. Again, that is watch.opensignalpdx.org. Thank you so much, Miriam.
Thank you.